Welcome to TORAH Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of TORAH Talk. This week coming to you is a beloved Rabbi Eli Cohen. So, Rabbi, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I really appreciate it. And it was definitely my delight of having you here in our phone calls. In our phone call we had, our Skype to call session earlier, we mentioned to you where I first saw you from. And it was very interesting. It was back in my know-it-all Messianic days. And it was nice to know that there are more people out there than just Rabbi Tovia Singer who's actually reaching out on the entire counter-missionary foot, if you will. Because honestly, I knew of you before I knew of Rabbi Singer. And although that may not be your direct focus is teaching against idolatry, you definitely had your hand involved in helping me out of it. That's for sure. And so having you on the show is for me a really wonderful delight. And I really appreciate you accepting my invitation for that.
Thank you for having me. And like I said to you yesterday, thank you for the positive feedback. It's always good to know that social media isn't just a bad thing. It can also be a good thing.
Yes.
And so, I'm really happy that I've been able to help some people, and that's wonderful.
That's perfect. I've seen you get a lot of traffic on your stuff on Facebook, and like you said, it's turned out to be a tool rather than just entertainment. It really is a tool to reach others, and I'm personally grateful for it. That's for sure. So for the viewers out here who don't know you, that may not have heard of Rabbi Eli Cohen, tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are. What's it like on your end of the world?
Well, okay, I've been in Australia for about close to 12 years, and I'm a rabbi of a synagogue out here in Sydney, Australia, and I have a wonderful little congregation here, and that's part of what I do. The other part of what I do is I run Jews for Judaism here in Australia. So Jews for Judaism is an international organization which is focused on trying to connect Jews back with their Judaism, with a focus on responding to the active proselytizing of Jews for Jesus and other groups like that, who try ever so hard to get Jewish people to come to accept Yeshua, Jesus, as the Jewish Messiah. And what we try to do and what we hope to do is to educate Jewish people, giving them a solid grounding in the Tanakh and giving them a better appreciation of the beautiful teachings of Judaism so that they can find their connection and their relationship with God very meaningful and very meaningfully within Judaism and within the teachings of the Torah. So that's really what I do. I'm originally from London. I grew up in an Orthodox community. My grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and so they came from Germany. They first got out from camps and managed to come over to London. Then they were interned to Australia. My grandfather was one of the De Niro boys, which is a famous boat that came across from England after the war broke out. And then after the war, he went back to England, married my grandmother, and I'm here to tell the story. I left London about the age of 15, went around studying in yeshivot in rabbinical colleges around the world, and I really never saw myself as getting involved in the counter-missionary scene at all. I was always planning to be a rabbi, so I was planning to be involved in the Jewish community, reaching out to Jews, teaching them, as many Chabad rabbis do. I grew up as Chabad, and so that's where I was heading. And in truth, it was only due to a massive blitz that Jews for Jesus did here in Australia once I was already here as a rabbi, that prompted the community to bring out Jews for Judaism to Australia, and to have Rabbi Kravitz and Rabbi Skobach came a couple of years earlier to come and address the community. And Rabbi Kravitz said, look, it's wonderful that we're coming and we're educating the rabbis, etc., but we need somebody on the ground. And I got very excited at the time, and I put up my hand. And it was a process. It was a couple of years, but eventually I was accepted onto the team after a lot of vetting and after a lot of guidance from Rabbi Skobek and Rabbi Kravitz, and at the time Scott Hillman and others. And it's been really an amazing journey. And the truth is, there's nothing more gratifying than having somebody tell you that you've been part of my journey, coming back to Hashem, coming back to a relationship with Hashem, removed from idolatry, removed from foreign teachings, and coming back to the Torah. So yeah, that's the long short of it.
That's really awesome. There's a whole lot of questions that come to my mind. Like, for example, so you were a rabbi already, and just doing the typical rabbi thing. And then
Correct.
The whole counter-missionary thing came into play. So did you, how much crunch time did you have to spend in reading and studying reading the New Testament literature to be able to get to that point to where you were an effective counter-missionary?
It's funny you asked that. I didn't pick up a New Testament ever in my life until I was 25. So I had never touched it, never mind looked at it. And I remember getting my first copy. It was a whole experience. Just touching it was just like, it was just a whole very, very spiritual experience, in the sense that I felt that I was touching something that was completely impure and I shouldn't be touching this, but I knew that I was doing it for the right cause. I had to spend a lot of time. Reading and studying. And in fact, Rabbi Skobek had very kindly put together a really long reading list for me in things that he felt that I needed to be aware of to be an effective counter-missionary. And it must have taken a good few years until, I would say it was from like 2004 until about 2007. Toward the end of 2007, until I was welcomed on board. And look, in truth, the main thing a person needs in order to be an effective counter-missionary are two qualities. Number one, you need to be honest. You need to have integrity, and at the same time, you need to be somebody who is passionate and knowledgeable within Judaism, because ultimately, once you are familiar with true, real currency, then you can spot a fake from a mile away. And you don't need to really be fluent in the New Testament to be able to engage people and bring them to the truth of Judaism and the truth of the Torah. It helps, for specific questions to have some familiarity, but it's not the most important part of counter-missionary work. In fact, I'll tell you something. One of the things that I do with Rabbi Skobek when I'm able to is we go to the Messianic conference, the UMJC conferences.
He told me about that.
Right, and
awesome.
And it's the most amazing experience. And there are different years, so we have different experiences. But I remember the first one that I went to was in Seattle. And when I went there, it was amazing. I didn't know what to expect. And I was sure that, most of my time would be, sitting there and debating biblical passages or passages from the New Testament. And it turned out that whole weekend was really focused on just teaching Torah, just teaching what Judaism has to say about so many things, and just, sharing inspiring teachings and thoughts from the rabbis. And the people that were at that conference were just so eager to listen and to partake and to engage. And I remember walking away and saying, I don't think I spoke about Jesus even once. But that's not true. I did. I think there was one conversation. But besides that, most of 95% of the conversations had nothing to do with Jesus, had nothing to do with the New Testament. People were just hungry for Torah. And so, yeah, that was really an amazing experience.
That sure sounds like it. You know, you make me think of the one thing that they used to teach in the church was that, you have to when bankers teach their employees how to identify a counterfeit, they have them study the original. Of course, they were using that to say study the New Testament, right, as versus other gods. And idealistically, that is true. In fact, if Christianity would take that advice that they give out and study what is the original, which is the Hebrew Scriptures, and just study that alone, they could tell just like that. In fact, that was one of the largest contributors to opening my mind and my eyes to seeing this. Was I decided one time I just wanted to stop with the whole New Testament stuff just until I could study the Torah. I was bummed out because I didn't know the laws of the Torah, and just the entire 5 books, the whole the Chumash and everything. And so I dedicated like a year and a half of doing nothing but going through Genesis to Deuteronomy over and over again until I was very comfortable with knowing what all was in it. And then after that, I went back to the New Testament and I was like, oh my goodness gracious, I cannot believe the contrast between the two. I'd never seen it before. But once I started studying just the original, so realistically, you don't need to study the counterfeit. You just need to study the original and you can spot the counterfeit. And that's kind of what you're saying, that, you had to just to be able to defend certain claims, but to know that it wasn't the authoritative anything, just studying the original, studying the Hebrew is just amazing. The Hebrew Scriptures are such a delight.
It is indeed.
Well, Rabbi, thank you for that. I think I'm probably going to benefit out of that little quick interview more than anybody, because I've been curious about that for a long time. So, okay. Well, for those of you who are tuning in, this is the weekly Torah Parsha. We are coming up on Exodus chapter 1, and Rabbi is going to take us off with it. I may jump in from time to time to ask a few questions, but for the most part, I'm just going to kind of be the silent guy unless I hear something that really makes me want to ask a question or bring something out. So Rabbi, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and so have fun with it and take as much time as you need. We'll pretty much kind of stick with an hour format, but if we go over, starting now, that is, I don't want to take my early questions as part of your Torah teaching time. You can start fresh.
Well, see, there's really a lot to go through in terms of what's covered in this week's Parsha. We're talking about many years covered in a very short amount of chapters, and so we'll start with the fact that we're starting the book of SHEMOS, the book of Exodus. SHEMOS in Hebrew actually means names, whereas Exodus is named after the whole theme of at least the beginning chapters of the book of Exodus, where we deal with the Exodus from Egypt, that the Jewish people are taken out of Egypt. And there are a lot of questions that arise right before we even start. I mean, just to give you a little bit of a insight into the complexities that arise. The first letter is already questioned in the book of Exodus. Why does the book of Exodus start with the Hebrew letter Vav? Vav is in Hebrew means and. Usually when there's a Vav at the beginning of a Hebrew letter, it means and. And so the word ve'ele, and these are. So ve'ele shemos bnei Yisrael, and these are the names of the children of Israel. The question arises, why do you need the and? Just drop the and just say these are. Why do you need the vav? And so you see that every single letter can be questioned, but I don't think we're going to have time to go through all the questions.
I just put the Hebrew up on screen, and it's really funny. This is just another simple example as to how the English, it kind of cheats out on what the Hebrew is actually saying, because actually in the King James, it just says now these are, not and. And so I love what you're saying right now. It's just another drop in the bucket. So
but the reason why it mentions these names, although we're already familiar with these names, because one of the principles that taught in Torah in terms of within Judaism is that the Torah is very, very frugal, very, very careful with every word, with every letter. Nothing is there for without reason. And so if there is an extra letter, there's a reason. And if we're going to start naming all the sons of Israel, the sons of Jacob, there must be a reason for it, because they're already mentioned in the book of Genesis a number of times. And so there really isn't any additional information that's being provided over here. So then really why, in the beginning of Exodus, does the Torah start out and tell us all the names once again? And so Rashi already comments on this, and Rashi basically says that the reason why God says it over again is because although God counted them by their names in their lifetime, he counted them again after they died to teach us how precious they were to him. And he compares it to the stars that it says in the book of Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 26. It says that he who takes out their hosts by name, by number, calls them all by name. And he compares the sons of Israel to the stars. And the reason why he mentions them again, even after they died, is to show how precious they were to God. I mentioned before that there was an extra vav at the beginning of the book of SHEMOS. One of the reasons given for this is because it's coming to teach us that there's a connection between those who came in the book of Genesis to those who come in the book of Exodus. You see, it's quite often you'll find that there are people who are very high in stature, and they are very holy and pious. But then when you go to the next generation or the generations after, there's a really major descent, and there's really often very little that connect the subsequent generations with the previous generations. They pale into insignificance. Whereas over here, the Torah is coming to tell us that the children of Jacob were righteous and pious like their forefathers, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's why the book of Shemot starts with above, to connect the two, to connect the children of Israel with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to say that they continue to hold on to that tradition. They continue to hold on to that faith, and they pass that on to their children and to their grandchildren. And one of the reasons why it mentions the names again is to teach us that the Jewish people, although they had left the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, and they had gone into the environment of Egypt, nevertheless, they held on to their names. They held on to their Jewish names, and they preserved that. And in fact, the Medrash says that that's one of the three merits that the Jewish people had to be redeemed, that they held on to their Jewish identity and their Jewish names. And that's why we mentioned all these names again. So that's how it starts off. I mentioned that there were a range of questions that start that arise at the beginning. Another question that is raised is, if this is the book of Exodus, if we're talking about the redemption, if we're talking about how the Jewish people are on the way to Mount Sinai, which is really the climax of the Torah, where the Jewish people have the encounter at Sinai, well then why do we start with the Jewish people descending into Egypt? Why do we include in the book of Exodus the story of how the Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt? Why doesn't the book of Exodus actually start a little bit later on? It could have started when it comes to that time where Moses comes and tells them that they're going to be redeemed. We start much, much earlier. And what's the reason for that? You get understanding the question?
Yeah, that's actually pretty cool, because I never even paid attention to those sorts of details before.
And so one of the answers to this question is that it's important that we understand that nothing is without reason. When God does something, he does everything for a reason. And when we talk about redemption, redemption is a process which includes within it the exile. In other words, whenever we are faced with a challenge, part of the process of getting to the solution is to embrace the challenge itself, to realize that God has brought that there for a reason, for a purpose. When God caused the Jewish people to go down to Egypt, there was a specific purpose that God had. There was a refining process that was part of the reason, but there was certain things that needed to be elevated by the Jewish people, where they would go into a different environment, and they would, by their mere being there and holding on to certain parts of their faith, etc., and not just holding on to it privately, but publicly displaying it, ultimately they would affect the Egyptians. And as God says later on in the book of Exodus, that the whole of Egypt shall know that I am God. And we need to appreciate in our own lives that we may be dispersed throughout the world. There are many living in Israel, but there are many that are living in the diaspora. And we often ask ourselves, well, what's the point of us living in the diaspora? Why can't we just have the redemption? And what we need to take from this week's Parsha is the inspiration to know that part of the exile is the process of redemption. Everything we do in exile, everything we do in the diaspora to bring God's name to the ends of the world is part of the process of the redemption. And that's why it's included within the book of Exodus, even though it's talking about the exile, but nevertheless it's included within the Exodus.
Nice.
And so we continue reading in the book of Exodus. It talks about how the Jewish people only came down with 70 people. And it's interesting that the Torah tells us that Joseph was in Egypt, as if we didn't know that. I mean, we just read the past few portions of the Torah, which talk all about Joseph in Egypt. But nevertheless, the Torah repeats it here. And this is to tell us that it's the same Joseph. Rashi tells us that it's to tell us that it's the same Joseph. It was Joseph who was the shepherd for his father in the land of Canaan, but it's the same Joseph with the same righteousness who was able to go out and be viceroy of Egypt without losing his faith, without losing his integrity and his piety. And not just that, Joseph kept his name too. He didn't change his name. He kept his name to Joseph, and it's the same Joseph that was in Egypt. But then we go on to read about the death of Joseph and his brothers and the entire generation, and we read how they grew and they multiplied. There were many, and in fact, the Medrash tells us that they multiplied in 6. When women gave birth, they would give birth to 6 children at a time, and the whole land was filled with the Jewish people. And as you can imagine, when you have the demographics changing,
sure,
where you have now many Jews being born, the Egyptians started to get worried. What's going to happen if they become a majority? And what will that do to Egypt? And what will happen if there'll ever be a war? Perhaps the Jews will side with the enemies, and then we're doomed. And so they had to come up with some kind of plan of how to stop this. And the best way to stop revolt is to enslave the people, because then there's no time. There's no time for a revolt, because they're just working so hard to fulfill their quotas every day. The Medrash tells us that what really was behind this decree is the astrologers of Pharaoh gazed into the stars, and they saw that the savior of the Jewish people was about to be born. And that being the case, it wasn't just a theory that they might revolt, but there was something that for them was tangible by them seeing in the stars that there was actually somebody that was going to come and rebel against Pharaoh And that was something that they were petrified, especially Pharaoh, was afraid of. And so they tried to oppress the Jewish people. And the Torah testifies that the more they oppressed the Jewish people, the more that they multiplied. And then there's a twist in the story where, not only did they enslave them, but they decided that they wanted to kill all the all the male children, and they enlisted the Jewish midwives, 2 Jewish midwives, to kill the Jewish male newborns. And the 2 midwives, who according to the Medrash and Rashi, were actually the sister and the mother of Moses, Yocheved and Miriam, who were called Shifra and Puah in the Bible over here. They were the ones that were commanded by Pharaoh not to allow the male children to live, but to actually kill them. And they did not listen. They actually kept them alive, and God rewards them with houses. Now, it's a bit strange. What does that mean? God rewards them with houses. Some commentators take it literally, that they were actually God made for them houses in which they could hide. Other commentators say no, that doesn't really make sense. But really what houses means is, as throughout the Bible, we find that when you talk about a house, it means a dynasty. So the house of David, or the house of, the house of somebody important, means that there's a very important household being born. And we know that the mother of Moses, from her came the house of all the priests. Aaron was her son, and there was the house of the priests. And Miriam was actually someone who married into the house of David, not to the house of David rather, but the house of Judah, the house of Judah. And her grandson ended up being Bezalel, the one who was going to erect the tabernacle for God. And so this was kind of God's way of repaying them for not listening to Pharaoh, even though it could have cost them their lives by not listening to Pharaoh. And so we continue reading the story about how Moses is born. This is already chapter 2. It talks about a man going out from the house of Levi, and he took and married the daughter of Levi. And the Medrash and Jewish commentators tell us that this wasn't the first marriage of this man, who we'll find out soon is Amram, because in fact he was already married before. We've just mentioned that Miriam was already alive. Moses was the youngest of the 3. And so what had happened is as follows. What happened was, after Pharaoh decreed that that all the firstborn boys should be put to death, Amram said, well, then what is the point of me remaining married and having children if they're going to be killed? And so therefore he separated from his wife, and he divorced his wife, and they were separated so that they shouldn't have any more children, so that they shouldn't be killed. And at that time, Miriam, who was a very young girl, but she was ahead of herself, and she turned around to her father, according to the Medrash, and says to her father, "Father, your decree is worse than the decree of Pharaoh." Why? Because Pharaoh decreed only on the boys, but by your actions, you are making the decree even against the girls, because by you separating from your wife, you're not even able to have daughters. And Amram, listening to what his daughter said, accepted what his daughter said to him, and therefore at this point he gets married again to his wife Yocheved, who was the daughter of Levi, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and this was Moses. So really, Moses is somebody who really owes a lot to Miriam, right? Mm-hmm. Not only do we read about a few verses later how Miriam watches him on the riverbank of the Nile, but in fact, without her, he may never have been born. Why is it important to mention this? Is because later on, when we read about how Miriam spoke negatively about Moses, it is extremely important to put it into the full context to understand that Miriam loved her brother, and Miriam had nothing negative towards her brother. On the contrary, she loved him, and anything that she said was ultimately in his interest. And nevertheless, she was judged for it, because when it comes to people who are righteous, and we know that Miriam was a prophetess, and God is very, very, very particular. And in this case, she spoke something which did cast Moses in a negative light, and she contracted leprosy as a result. But it's important to realize that she gave her life for Moses, and she loved him very dearly. But anyway, we continue on in the Parsha, that they managed to hide Moses for 3 months. This is because he was born premature. He was a premature baby, and therefore the Egyptians weren't expecting him to be born at that time. So they were able to hide him. But after 3 months, they were no longer able to hide him. And that's when Miriam put him in a basket and, watched him at the edge of the water. Now, there's a little bit of a disagreement where exactly Moses was placed. Some people say that he was placed in the River Nile. Some say that he was placed next to the River Nile. And the reason for this disagreement is because the River Nile was considered to be the idol of Egypt. That's what they worshipped. And it's forbidden to use idolatry for any purpose. And to save one's life when it comes to idolatry, it's one of the things that we don't engage in. And not wanting to use the River Nile to save Moses, Miriam placed him on the side. And one of the commentators actually says that after the daughter of Pharaoh goes to bathe herself in the River Nile, which was a way of disregarding the sanctity or whatever it was of the River Nile. In other words, she was coming to defile and to show how she was irreverent to the River Nile.
Really? So that wasn't a practice of theirs. It was to bathe in the Nile?
Well, it seems that the River Nile itself wasn't a place where you would go and bathe, because it was something that they worshipped. You would perhaps take water from the River Nile or from some other place, from a well, and then somehow warm it up and bathe in your own home. And we know that Pharaoh bathed in his own home. So the question is, why did Miriam wait and not place him immediately in the river? It was because she felt that this was a place of idolatry, and only after the daughter of Pharaoh went out to bathe herself, in which case she nullified the idolatry of the River Nile by acting in this way, did she allow the basket holding Moses to slip into the water, and that's when Batya found him. Nice. So Pharaoh finds Moses, and she notices that the child is crying, and she recognizes that this is a Jewish child, and she tries to save the child against her father's wishes. But it seems that she had a good heart, and she wasn't in the same boat as her father in terms of his ideas. And she tried to feed the baby, but the baby would not feed off her. And Miriam came out from her hiding place and said, "Would you like me to go and get a Jewish woman, a Jewish midwife, to come and take care of the baby?" To which Batya said yes, and she went and got the mother of Moses, Yocheved, and for that while, Yocheved, the mother of Moses, took care of the child, and then afterwards she gave the baby back to Batya to be raised in the house of Pharaoh. And it's interesting that the name that Moses receives, Moses, he actually gets not from a Jewish source, but he gets from an Egyptian source. He gets it from the daughter of Pharaoh, who's the one that calls him Pharaoh because she drew him from the water. And that's where his name comes from.
Moses. Okay, got him.
And then we continue to read how Moses grows up, and there's differences of opinion whether he was 20 or 40, or whatever the case is. At a certain point in his adulthood, he goes out and he sees the plight of the Jewish people. And all of a sudden, he turns left and right, and he sees that there's no one around. And but he sees that there's an Egyptian that's hitting a Jew. And what he does is he hits the Egyptian, and then he buries him in the sand. And what's interesting is that over here, what we find is one of the signs of a true leader. You see, Moses wasn't somebody who, went out to war on a daily basis. That's not who he was. It's not what he was about. On the contrary, we find that later on, when it comes to him being a shepherd, he takes extreme care to be gentle and to be soft, even with sheep, how much more so with human beings. But what happened is, it says over here that he looked around to the left and to the right, and he saw that there was no one there. In other words, there was no one that was doing anything about it. And when he realized that there's no one doing anything about it, he stepped up to the plate and said, if no one's going to do something about it, I've got to do something about it. And that's truly a sign of a leader who, it doesn't matter what the job is. It's a matter of seeing whether it's getting done or not. And if it's not getting done, then I need to do it.
Right.
And it doesn't matter what the job might be. And we find throughout the history of Judaism, the true leaders of the generation were the people who were interested in doing everything that needed to be done regardless of the job. So if it was to learn with little children, they would learn with little children. We know that Mordechai, in the story of Purim, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, he was the leader of the Jews of the generation. He would gather little children to recite verses of the Torah together, because if there was no one else doing it, he felt that someone has to do it, and he would do it. And this is true of all the leaders within Judaism, that they looked to the left and the right and saw what needed to be done, and then just went and did it. And this is what Moshe does. And in fact, this costs Moshe, because what happened at the end is that Pharaoh found out that this had happened, and then he sought to kill Moshe. And Moses had to run away. He had to run away to Midian, and that was in order to save his life. He was worried for his life. And this is where he actually gets to meet his wife. We know that they were at the well. The daughters of Jethro were at the well, and what had happened was, people don't always understand this part of the story. Well, why are the shepherds all of a sudden beating up on the daughters of Jethro? And really what had happened was Jethro, who used to be a priest for idolatry, had studied and come to his own understanding and recognition that God of Israel is the only true God. And so he renounced his faith in all the other gods. And as a result of that, the other farmers and the other shepherds and people were upset with him, and they started causing trouble for the children. And when he didn't have any sons, so it's his daughters that went out to try and give the sheep water, etc. And these shepherds were starting up with these girls. Moses comes along, and he was resting at the well. He sees what's happening. He gets up again, and he saves them from these people, and he helps them to give the sheep to drink. And then the daughters come home, and Jethro says, well, where's the guy who saved you? Because they told him the whole story, and they ran back to get him. He came, and he ate with Jethro, and as they say, the rest is history. He ended up marrying Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. He has a child. He calls the child Gershom, And then what happens is that Pharaoh dies. According to Rashi, he doesn't like to accept, this is in chapter 2, verse 23, he doesn't want to accept that Pharaoh literally died, because what happens afterwards as a result is a bit confusing. If Pharaoh died, well, then why would the Jews start complaining and crying out to God? I mean, that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? That Pharaoh died. And so Rashi says that really what happened was he was struck with a particular leprosy that was so bad that in the Talmud it is often seen as being synonymous with death. It's really, really bad. And what happened as a result is his doctors, according to the Medrash, his doctors told him that the best way to recover from this is to to bathe himself in Jewish blood, in the blood of children, and about 120 kids were killed daily, so that he could bathe in it, and that's what they were crying out to God for. And so really, he didn't really die, but he had this terrible disease, and that caused him to want to slaughter the Jewish children. Anyway, God hears the cries of the Jewish people. He remembers the merits of the forefathers, the promise that he made, the covenant that he made with Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, and he sees what happened, and this is the time where he decides it's time to take them out. And at that time, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Yisrael, and he takes them into the desert. And we're told what happens is that one of the sheep goes astray. It was running away, and Moses noticed that it's running, and he runs after it. And finally, the sheep gets to a well, and Moses realizes the reason why the sheep was running is because it was thirsty. Instead of getting angry with the sheep, he apologized. He almost apologizes to the sheep, saying, "I didn't realize that the reason why you're running away is because you're thirsty. You must be exhausted." And he mounts the sheep on his shoulders and carries the sheep back with him. And we're told in the Medrash that when God saw this, God said, "This is the one who takes so much care and sensitivity for sheep. He's the one that I want to take care of my people, of my sheep." And so this is the point in the story where he sees a wondrous sight. He sees that there's a thorn bush which is on fire, but it's not being consumed. And because it was such a wondrous sight, he decides that he's going to turn aside and he's going to see what's going on. God tells him that, don't come any closer, because where you're standing is on holy ground. Take off your shoes. And he introduces himself as the God of his fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Moses, in all humility, looks away. He doesn't see himself worthy of seeing such a wondrous sight, and he looks away. And later on, he's rewarded for that. But he looks away. And God tells him, "Look, I've seen the plight of my people, and it's time. I'm going to go down, and I'm going to raise them up, and I'm going to bring them to the land flowing with milk and honey." And he's basically telling Moses that I want to send you to take out the Jewish people from Egypt. And Moses, again, in his humility, asks God, who am I that I should go and take the Jewish people out of Egypt? And God says to him, I appreciate your humility, and I appreciate that you don't see yourself as worthy or capable, but when I tell you that I'm going with you, I'll give you the strength to be able to take them out. And it's interesting that of all the signs that Moses could receive from God, that he would indeed be successful, to know some kind of gauge, litmus test, to know whether or not he was being the true leader that God wanted him to be. In verse 12, of chapter 3, God tells him, this is going to be the sign that I give you, that you will know that I truly sent you. What's the sign? The sign is when you take the people out of Egypt and you bring them to this mountain to worship God. In other words, once the Jewish people reach Mount Sinai, accept upon themselves the Torah, and worship God, you know that you are the true leader of the Jewish people. And it's not, when you split the sea, and it's not when you do any other miracle. It's rather when you are able to see that you've been able to bring an entire nation to come and to serve God. Then you know you are truly the leader that has been chosen by God. And
Rabbi, that whole idea with Deuteronomy 13, 1-5, which still resides as one of the biggest, I call it the biggest sledgehammer against idolatry, fits that perfectly. I mean, the sign isn't that he's going to perform miracles or that anything else. The sign is he's going to bring them to this mountain. They're going to worship God. They're going to get the Torah. And so the test for the false prophet is not whether he can do signs and wonders and miracles, but is he teaching Torah or not? And, and that's the one thing that really I had to pull out of this context, or shall I say, put back into the context for me to be able to pull out of the idolatry situation as well.
Correct. And it's important for people to know, even today, who is the true leader? Who is the true teacher of Torah? And I believe that the ultimate litmus test is whether or not this person is bringing people back into observance of the laws of Hashem, bringing people to worship God, to submit themselves before God, and to improve their relationship with God. Because anything less than that is really not what it's all about. Right. And Moses is the one who shows us the way. And then Moses comes along and he says to God, Moses is kind of being practical over here, saying that, I'm going to come to the Jewish people and I'm going to tell them that God has sent me, right? He sent me to you, and they're going to ask me, what's his name? And so what should I tell them? Now, this is a very, very enigmatic passage. What does it mean? It's very obscure. What does it mean they're going to ask what's his name? As if Moses didn't know that there was a God. He knew there was a God. He grew up in Egypt, and, the Jewish people had a faith in God. What does this mean they're going to ask what's his name? And a name, when we speak about God, really usually refers to the attributes of God. And basically what he's asking is not really for what's your name. He's not asking, tell me your name so I can identify you to the Jewish people. But rather, he's saying, listen, God, I'm going to come back to the Jewish people. And I'm going to tell them that you sent me to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. And you know what they're going to say to me? If he's really God, and he really cares about us, well then, why did it take so long for him to hear us? Why did it take so long for him to send somebody to take us out of Egypt? Why did it take him so long to actually care about our suffering? And so Moses is asking God, what can I tell the Jewish people when they ask this question? And when we read God's answer, we'll find that the answer really is answering the question. The answer that God says is, what you should tell them is, I will be that which I will be. And as the commentators explain, what this means is God's promising them and telling them that I will always be with you. I am together with you. And it says in Isaiah chapter 63 that in all their suffering, God too suffers with them. And the Jewish people have to realize that although this was ordained by God, and that this is something that they had to go through, it's something that God empathized with them all the way through, and that in the future, if there would ever be any future suffering, it's not as if God is blind to the suffering, but in his infinite wisdom and understanding and kindness has to put us through what we go through, but joins in with us in our suffering. And that's what he's telling them. I will be that which I shall be. And what happens is, you read in verse 14, and God says to Moses, right? Thus shall you say to the Jewish people, I will be sent me to you. And so here he's, instead of saying I will be that which I will be, he says I will be. There's no double expression at the end when he tells them what to tell the Jewish people. And the commentators, they notice that immediately, and they ask, well, what's this about? And what they say is that Moses said, well, God, if I'm going to tell them that there's going to be more suffering in the future, right? Because what you're essentially saying is that I've always been with you, but I will be with you again in future suffering. That's not going to sound very good to them. And God said, 100%, I wasn't planning on you to tell them both parts. I only want you to tell one part, and that's what he tells Moses to do. And then he tells them to tell the Jewish people that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sent me to you. This is his name, and this is how I shall be recalled in every generation. And then he says that you should gather the elders of the Jewish people, and you should tell them that God appeared to me, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he said to me that I will bring you out of from the affliction of Egypt. And he uses the same terminology over here in verse 16, the same terminology with which we concluded the book of Genesis, because Joseph tells the Jewish people at the time that when God will remember you and take you out from Egypt, and he uses the word, let me just look it up so I don't say it wrong. It's he says, that when God will surely remember you, right? And then he makes them promise to take their bones out. So they remembered the words that this was passed down through tradition, right? To the people that were living in Egypt, that there were certain words that Joseph used in terms of the redemption, and that is that God would remember them. And therefore God tells Moses to use the same words. Tell them, I've remembered you, and and he's going to take them out from Egypt. And that would be another sign for them to know that Moses was sent actually by God. And God says, I've heard everything, and I'm going to take you out from the land of Egypt and take you to the land flowing with milk and honey. And God tells Moses that they're going to listen to your voice. And he promises him that, if you should go together with he tells them you should go together with the elders of Israel to the king of Egypt, and you should tell him that the God of the Jews called upon us, and now we want to go out for 3 days into the desert and to worship God, to offer up sacrifices to God. And God already forewarns that what's going to happen is that the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, is not going to let them go, but it's going to be a battle. And God says, I'm going to send my hand and smite the Egyptians with all my wonders that I'm going to do in their midst. And only afterwards will they be freed. And when they are freed, they won't leave empty-handed. What they're going to do, they're going to leave with gold and silver and clothes and all kinds of things. They would basically empty out Egypt of all its wealth. And we read later on that that's exactly what happened. Now, Moses in chapter 4 makes a very big mistake. What's the mistake that he makes? He makes the mistake that not just Moses, but many others made after him. And that is, he spoke negatively about the Jewish people to God. And God does not like that. God doesn't like when people speak not nice about the Jewish people. Yes, there are times when God sends prophets to berate the Jewish people and to tell them to get back on the straight and narrow path and to return to God. But when it comes to a prophet or any person coming before God, who speaks negatively about the Jewish people, we always find that this is something that God is very upset. We find it in Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah speaks negatively about the Jewish people. We find it in Numbers 22 when Bilam tries to speak negatively about the Jewish people, and in all cases we find that God does not appreciate when people speak negatively about his son, about the Jewish people. And what does Moses say? He says, they're not going to believe me. They're not going to listen to me, because they'll say that God didn't appear to you. Now, when I say he made a mistake, it's not that he was wrong. He was right. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we read later on that the Jewish people didn't want to listen to Moses, right? So what did he do wrong? He felt that because they had suffered so much, they weren't going to just, listen to somebody who comes along and makes fanciful promises. They're going to say, look, we want something to prove that you're real. And he felt that the Jewish people were going to want something more to hold on to prove that he was really sent by God. But nevertheless, God was not happy with it, and he says, take the stick that's in your hand and throw it to the ground, and it became a snake. And that was one way of God indicating that the way he had spoken about the Jewish people was not proper. Then he grabs it by the tail, it turns back into a stick. So that was one thing he was to perform in front of the Jewish people. The next thing is he tells, put your hand into your bosom. And over there, what happened was his hand turned white, and he took it and then he put it back in, and it turned back normal. And the third thing was the miracle of the blood. But what these things indicated to the Jewish people was that Moses was given these signs to show that what happens when you speak negatively about God about the Jewish people, God does not take it lightly. And that's why Moses, for a short period, had this leprosy, right? Had this leprosy on his hand for speaking negatively about the Jewish people. And anyway, after all of that, Moses turns around and he finds another reason why he shouldn't go. And he says, look, I have a stutter. And so therefore I'm not able to speak very well. I have a speech impediment, and maybe somebody else should go instead of me. Now, where does this speech impediment come from? So the Medrash tells us that what happened was when Moses was a child, some of the advisors of Pharaoh noticed that this boy was a very smart child, and he was, it seemed that he was going after the things that kings go after. He was somebody that was very bright, and they were worried for Pharaoh that he was going to be, the signs that he was showing is that he would ultimately rebel and overthrow Pharaoh. And they told Pharaoh, get rid of him while he's a child, don't wait for him to grow up. And Pharaoh started to take their advice seriously. And one of his advisors says, you know what, he's just a child, just let's make a test, and we'll bring out gold and we'll bring out hot coals, and they're both shiny, and they're both they both look good, and we'll see whether the child takes the gold or the coals. If he takes the gold, then we know that he's really after the crown, and if he goes for the coals, then he's just a child. And Moses was about to go for the crown, and as the Medrash tells us, there was an angel came and pushed his hand away and made it touch the coals. He burnt his hand so badly that he quickly put his hand into his mouth, as babies do. And as a result, he burnt his tongue or his mouth, and that's where the speech impediment came from. And it also, it's interesting that God chose somebody who has a speech impediment to tell us that, Moses wasn't listened to because he was a charismatic leader or because he was a great orator, but rather because he had the truth, and that's what he preached. And as difficult as it was for him to talk, nevertheless, the Jewish people listened because they knew that he was sent by God. But in any event, he asks that somebody else should be sent in his stead, and God was very upset by his refusal these few times. And God says to him, here, behold, your brother Aaron, the Levite, he will be your spokesman for you. and he'll see you, and he'll be happy, and you'll tell him everything I told you, and he will go and speak in your stead. Now, the commentators note immediately that why is it important to mention that Aaron was a Levite? Why did God tell him, your brother Aaron the Levite is coming? What he's telling Moses is, because you refused these times to go as my messenger, therefore Aaron, who is a Levite, he's the one that's going to become the priest and not you. Because Aaron, although he started out as a Levite, eventually became chosen as the one who was going to be the priest, whereas it may have been Moses, had Moses listened to God the first time, because he, for whatever reason, chose not to want to go and be the messenger. He was humble, and he was hoping that somebody else would do the job. He felt other people would be more fit. God said, okay, you've pushed me enough, and now, as a result, Aaron is going to be the one who's going to be the priest, and you'll remain the Levite.
Nice.
And he makes Aaron now the spokesman for Moses, and they took the stick, and they went together to do all these miracles. He first goes and takes permission from his father-in-law Jethro, that he has to go back to his brothers, and Jethro says no problem. And God tells Moses that you don't have to worry about anybody who wants to kill you. They're all gone. They're all dead. And so Moses takes his wife and his children, and they start on the road. And there's a very strange story. All of a sudden, on the way, there's this snake that comes and threatening to kill Moses, and they couldn't figure out what it was until Zipporah realized it must be that their son wasn't circumcised. So she quickly circumcised her son, and then the snake disappeared, which goes to show how important circumcision is, and that even though Moses was on the way to do the mission of God, but the fact that he hadn't circumcised his son was enough that he was about to be killed for not doing that. So from there we learn one of the places we learn the importance of Jewish people being circumcised, and any person who is Jewish and is not circumcised, every moment that they postpone it is a terrible thing, and they should do everything they can to organize a circumcision as soon as possible. And that's something that is very evident here in the portion over here of SHEMOS. And then we,
Is there any particular reason why Gershom was not Moshe's successor as opposed to Joshua? I think the Torah does state that, or at least the Midrash somewhere mentions something, because he wasn't there in the wilderness with them. But is there any other reason why there would not be a succession of Moshe of his own lineage?
So there's a few reasons that can be given. One is God didn't want any nepotism.
Gotcha.
No, but I'm just kidding. No, that's not the reason. So the reason is one of the reasons given by the Chassam Sofer, a very respected teacher. The Chassam Sofer writes that when we read about Moses and Aaron coming down from the mountain, we find that it speaks about the generations of Moses and Aaron. And then it only goes to list the children of Aaron. This is in the book of Numbers. It doesn't list the children of Moses. And he says over there, very interestingly, that because Moses was, by divine decree, appointed to lead the Jewish people, sometimes when a person is so involved in leading a people, being a leader to a community and to people, the children suffer as a result. And because Moses did not invest the time that is needed to produce the next generation of children to follow in their ways, that's why ultimately his children didn't follow. It's just really a consequence, natural result of not having the time to invest in your children. And that's why his children, Gershom, his child Gershom and the other one, Eliezer, were not able to be his successors.
Can I
And
further?
in fact, yep.
Can I further the question?
Sure.
The other thought is I was thinking about with Joseph and with Ephraim and Manasseh, how both Moses and Joseph had Egyptian wives. And so I'm wondering, is that why maybe why Yaakov was able to bring in Ephraim and Manasseh, because Joseph was teaching them Torah? And is there any connection at all?
It's clear that that Joseph invested a lot of time in his children, and he raised them very carefully in order to ensure that they would remain steadfast to his heritage, to the teachings of Jacob, etc. And therefore they did merit to become included as part of the children of Jacob. And yes, it seems, at least from the Chassam Sofer, it seems that that because Moses wasn't able to offer his children the time that they needed, they ultimately did not end up being like the children of Aaron, who did follow on in his footsteps, because they had received guidance and teaching from their father. And that was part of the sacrifice that Moses had to do and give for the Jewish people. God needed him on call all the time, and this did affect ultimately his family. It affected his marriage. It affected his kids. It affected everything. And why? This is something we leave to God. We don't know why it had to be that way, but that's the way it happened. Then we see that what happens is that they come to Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh, and they tell him exactly what God says: "Let my people go, and let them come out and serve me in the desert." And Pharaoh says, "Who's this God? Why should I listen to him? I don't know God, and I'm not going to let the Jewish people go." And they get into a bit of a argument, and basically Pharaoh turns around and says, "This is ridiculous. Why should Moses and Aaron come and start, disturbing the Jewish people from their work? Then they're going to start complaining, etc. Forget it. What we need to do is we need to stamp out any kind of messianic frenzy that may be stirring up within the Jewish community. There's this idea that they're going to go out and they're going to be redeemed, etc., etc. This must be because they have too much time on their hands. When people have too much time on their hands, they start having all kinds of ideas. We've got to stamp it out." And what he did was he says they're being lazy, and so therefore they're crying. They want to go out and worship God. What we need to do is we need to make the work even harder. And so therefore, what's going to happen is we're not going to give them any more straw to make the bricks. And notwithstanding that, they still have to fill the quota of bricks that they needed to make. And this made life extremely difficult for the Jewish people. And basically, they came out to Moses and they were screaming at Moses, saying, "Listen, well, what have you done? You haven't made anything better. You've only made things worse. Who needed you?" Kind of like, things were good before you got here, as bad as they were. But now you're coming over here, you made things worse for us. And Moses, not knowing what to do and feeling the plight of the Jewish people, went back to God and he says, "Listen, what's all this about?" He says, "Listen, why have you done bad to these people? Why didn't you bother sending me? From the time that you sent me to speak in your name, things have only got worse, and you haven't saved the Jewish people." And God tells him, "Look, you hang in there. You watch. Now you'll see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh, and with a strong hand, I will have them driven out of the land of Egypt, i.e., not just will they leave, but the Egyptians will be begging for them to leave. Just go. Just take whatever you want and go." And that's how we end off this week's Parsha. It's a bit of a down note, but they say the moment before the dawn is the darkest point of the night, and just before God is about to wrought these miracles and bring the Jewish people out of Egypt, things got a little bit more difficult. But at the end of the day, we need to recognize that God's always there with us. And even at the most difficult point, God is holding our hand, and God is going to make everything right. And we just need to trust. We need to trust in God that He will be there for us, and that He will carry through on His promises. And the more trust we have, the sooner the salvation will come. The sooner we will be taken out of our situations which are causing us anguish and pain.
Sure.
So that's the Parsha. In a nutshell, there's so much more that could be said, but
right.
But this is the beginning of a book which speaks all about the redemption and the exodus from Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is also from the word Meitzar. Meitzar means constraints, and we all have our own constraints, our own limitations. And when we read about the exodus from Egypt, we all need to think about our own Egypt and our own constraints and our own things which are preventing us from going out to serve God. And we need to know that God's going to do everything for us, so that we should be able to serve Him. We just need to stand up and be strong. And as they say, don't tell God how big your troubles are. Tell your troubles how big your God is, and stand up strong and say that notwithstanding any of my challenges, I'm going to go out, I'm going to serve God, I'm going to serve Him with sincerity and with truth. And I know that God will be there all the way through, helping me to reach that goal of being able to serve God at the mountain. And so there you have it.
That is fantastic, Rabbi. I can't believe how much I really enjoyed listening to this today. This has been fantastic. I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully 6 to 8 weeks from now, maybe sooner if we find something else to talk about before then. So, Rabbi, thank you again so very much. Folks, thank you for tuning in. We'll see y'all same time, same place next week, 3 p.m. Sunday Central. Take care, all. Shalom, shalom. Shalom tov, Rabbi.
Shalom and shalom tov.
אני אתה אתם תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.